everyone. Hi. It's so good to see so many faces out there, lots of familiar faces, but some new ones too. And it's great to see a lot of interest in the community for this event. A quick reminder, there's food in the back. If you're ever feeling antsy or hungry, feel free to get up and go grab some food. And also please turn off your cell phones if they're loud. Okay, so a little bit about myself. My name is Zoe Gerstle. I was born and raised in Traverse City. And last spring, I finished my sophomore year and decided to take a year off of college and take some time to pursue other interests. So what this looked like in the fall was spending 3 months with my sister Talia, volunteering in a refugee camp. And that's what we're here to tell you about today.
So my name is Talia, as Zoe mentioned, and as you can probably tell, I'm her sister. And after graduating from the University of Michigan, I moved to Spain, to Madrid, and there I was working with refugees, and that's what kind of first exposed me to the refugee crisis in Europe. And as Zoe mentioned, she decided to take a gap year, and so together we decided to go to a refugee camp in Greece and work with people there.
All right, so before I get started, I would just like to say thank you to some local businesses who provided the refreshments in the back, to Emmylou Sherlock, who helped with the organizing of this event back there, to Jason Tank, who helped set up the recording for the event, and of course to our parents, Margie and Roger, and our fabulous sister Lena, who have supported us every step of the way. So with that, we'll get started. All right. There are more forcibly displaced people in the world now than any time since World War II. So before I get into the consequences of that fact, I want to go over a little bit of terminology. A migrant is an umbrella term for anyone who's leaving their home for an extended period of time. And so there are multiple subsections of a migrant. There's an internally displaced person, and this is someone who is forcibly displaced from their home. This means they are all but forced to leave for any number of reasons. But in order to find safety, they do not have to cross an international border, so they stay within their country. And then there are immigrants, all the way on the right, and this can be legal or illegal immigration, but the key here is that they're leaving on their own accord, and they're not being forced from their homes. And then we have asylum seekers and refugees, and that's mostly who we're going to be talking about today. And like IDPs, asylum seekers and refugees are forced from their homes. But like immigrants, they cross international borders to find that safety. So most refugees cross borders illegally. And once they reach a country that's safe for them to live, they start the legal process of applying for asylum status. If a country is going to grant an individual asylum status, the individual must prove that they were forced to leave for their own safety. So this process can take a couple months, a couple years. It depends on the country and what the person's fleeing from. The exception to this order is actually the United States, where most frequently refugees will apply for asylum from a third country, and then once they're granted that asylum, they will be able to move to the United States. So there are many situations that cause refugees, for people to become refugees. Sometimes a large portion of a country will become a refugee. For example, Syria, middle of a civil war, been going on for many years now, and there are Syrian refugees all over the world. But sometimes there are refugees from relatively stable countries. So for example, when Talia was working with refugees in Spain, she met refugees from Colombia who were escaping persecution for their sexual orientation. So being a refugee can look like a lot of different things. One thing that's pretty common in the refugee process is that it's long and unstable. So often a refugee will flee their home country, find refuge in a neighboring country, and live there for 2, 5, 10 years, only to find that neighboring country becomes unsafe and they have to move again. And one thing that I want to cover real quick before we get into more detail is that there's a common misperception that refugees are poor and are seeking better economic opportunity. In fact, most refugees are middle class, and some of them are upper class, and most of them have really good lives at home. Many refugees that Talia and I met wanted to go back to their home country as soon as it was possible, and as it was safe. But keep in mind, as we talk about refugees, these are people who are being forced to flee for reasons that they cannot control. So to focus a little bit more on the European refugee crisis, that started mostly in 2014, and it peaked in 2015. So many of you may remember the picture that came out in September of 2015 of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian who washed up on the Turkish shore after his family tried to cross to Greece. So this is when the peak of the crisis was happening, and it's also when the peak of the media coverage was happening, but the crisis is still going on. There's still hundreds of refugees coming every week by boat, these same dangerous crossings. And the situation is pretty unstable. So people take a variety of routes. You can see here on the map, often coming from Turkey, but also northern Africa. And the route that a refugee takes depends on where they're coming from, of course, but also the politics of border control. So Talia's going to tell you in a little bit about some Turkish border control politics. And when they tightened up their border, the path from Libya to Italy all of a sudden became much more heavily used. So what I want you to get from this is that the crisis is ongoing and very much in flux.
So as Zoe mentioned, politics have a really big influence on the flows of refugees through Europe. And so the most influential political move, especially on the Greek islands, was the EU-Turkey deal. And in March of 2016, leaders of all 28 European Union countries met with Turkish leaders to discuss the huge numbers of migrants that were arriving to Europe. And so they agreed that all irregular arrivals would be returned to Turkey. And irregular arrivals were people that didn't have a valid asylum claim or people that were coming from a safe third country. And so if Turkey was being considered a safe country for refugees, then all refugees were going to have to be returned back to Turkey. In exchange, Turkey was given 6 billion euros to improve the conditions at refugee camps and also increase their security at the border. And so really, the main flaw with this deal is that Turkey is not a safe country for many refugees. There are countless records of human rights violations, including no medical care, no education, people are completely cut off from the outside world, there are inhumane living conditions, and people are sometimes even sent back to Syria or whatever other country they are coming from. And so since April of 2016, when this deal was put into place, there have been a lot of legal challenges that prove that Turkey is not a safe country for refugees to live. And so basically, the deal is that Europe is paying Turkey 6 billion euros, and in exchange, hopefully they will get less refugees. And so as you can see, this is very controversial. This was from a protest on a Greek island, and refugees are holding up a sign that says, "We are not for sale, stop the deals." So Zoe and I were volunteering on the Greek island of Lesbos. And as you can see in this picture, Lesbos is very close to Turkey. At its closest point, it's actually only 4.1 miles. And so that's, if you think about East Bay, you cross East Bay twice, widthwise, and you're from Turkey to Lesbos. And so as Zoe mentioned, in 2015, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees that came onto the shores of this really small island. In fact, over 500,000 people came that year in 2015. And so currently, there are very few legal ways for someone that's a refugee to come to Europe because Europe is so overwhelmed with people. And so as a result, people pay over 1,000 euros. They pay a smuggler to make this pretty dangerous crossing from Turkey over to Lesbos. And they're always coming in these little boats, like you can see here. These boats are made for 20, 25 people, and we've heard stories of people coming in with 70 or 80. And so they're overpacking these boats tremendously, a lot more even than this picture shows. And people typically have to live in Turkey for 1 to 2 years so they can make enough money to make this crossing with their family. And if they pay, let's say, 6,000 euros for a family of 5, there's no guarantee that they're going to get across. And so we met people who the first and second and even third times that they tried to come, they were caught by the Turkish police and sent back. And so there's no guarantee even if they are able to pay this money. So this quote is about this crossing. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So when a refugee arrives to Lesbos, before the EU-Turkey deal was put into place, boats were landing, oftentimes many every day, and the refugees had to walk to the main town on the island. And from there, within a couple of days, they would go to Athens and get all of their paperwork processed there. But since the EU-Turkey deal, each boat is met by an official organization that's authorized by the Greek police. And the refugees are taken to a camp called Moria, the largest camp on Lesbos, where they're held in detention for the first 30 days. And after this period, they're allowed to leave the camp. They still live there, but they can go around the island. And people then go through a series of interviews while living in a camp on Lesbos, and they have to prove that Turkey is not a safe country for them. And this process can take anywhere from a couple of months to over 2 years. And we talked to a lot of different people while we were there about, okay, why do some people only stay for 3 months and other people are there for 3 years? And really nobody seemed to have a good answer. And so, for example, we met a family. They had 7 children. The mom had brain cancer. They were from Syria. They had a young kid who was just 1 year old and another girl with a serious ear problem. So all of these are factors that would make you think that they would be expedited, that their case would go quickly. And they were on Lesbos for over 2 years. And so they just kind of demonstrate that there really is no order, it seems, to why people have to wait different amounts of time. So we just went through a lot of different definitions and concepts. And so we want to give you a minute to ask any clarifying questions. We will have an opportunity at the end to ask questions about our experience and anything else. But if anyone has any questions about any of the definitions we've gone over, now is your chance.
The direction that people are coming. So people are
Yeah.
coming from Turkey to Lesbos and trying to get into the EU?
Yes, exactly. Great question. Yeah, so because it's only 4 miles, that's why so many people are coming to Lesbos versus if you, do you want to go back to the map?
Mm-hmm.
Versus another, crossing from Libya to Italy is a lot farther. And a lot of people are coming from Syria, which you can see is close, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so they go through Turkey, and then Lesbos is their first stopping point into Europe. Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
All right, so as Talia mentioned, Moria Refugee Camp is the largest camp on the island. It's the main camp. And as I talk, you're going to see footage of someone walking through the camp. So that'll give you a pretty good visual to my description. Moria was originally built as a prison and repurposed as a refugee camp. But most people who live inside it say it still feels like a prison. It has a capacity for 1,800 people, but has about 6,000 at this point, so that's more than triple over capacity. And as you can imagine, that leads to really atrocious conditions. For every meal, refugees must wait in line to get their food. So with 6,000 refugees, that often means a wait of 3 to 4 hours for every meal. And then when they get the food, it's insufficient. It'll be a piece of bread and a piece of cheese or something like that. There's medical care during the day at Moria and not during the night. So at night, they're just kind of stuck there. And during the day, the medical care is really overwhelmed. They're only seeing the most emergent cases. There's actually no psychological care at a refugee camp. So if a refugee needs psychological treatment, they walk 5 miles down the road to the nearest clinic. And there's a 300-person waiting list. And unless someone has already attempted suicide, they cannot get on that list. That's how overwhelmed this clinic is. They're not even accepting patients who have PTSD or anxiety or depression. It's only the most severe of cases. So in Moria, you may have heard of the fights that break out, especially at night, and sometimes those fights cause fires. Basically, what's happening is the stress and fear of living in a refugee camp exacerbates the already existing tensions, political and religious and otherwise. And it's quite an unsafe place to live. Especially at night, it's unsafe for women and children, who make up 2/3 of the population of the camp. And it's gotten so bad that an organization has started handing out adult diapers to women at night so that they don't have to fear for their lives if they have to relieve themselves. You can see here that's the ration of food that they get after waiting in line for hours. So we get to this question, why are things the way they are? Why is Moria so horrible? And there's a couple reasons to think that it shouldn't be. First of all, this is not a surprise anymore. It's been going on since 2014. And we know that the European Union has money that could be directed towards these camps because remember, they gave 6 billion euros to Turkey to improve Turkey's camps. So when Talia and I were there and we were asking this question, we talked to locals from Greece, we talked to volunteers and activists and refugees themselves, and we kept hearing the same theory over and over again about Moria. And since we've come home, we've been reading a lot of articles, and some journalists seem to support this theory as well. So the Washington Post calls Moria a deliberate European strategy to keep people away. The BMJ opinion says Moria has been intentionally neglected by European governments in the hope that it will act as a deterrent to others considering making the journey to Europe. And Dimitris Christopoulos says this is why the EU turns a blind eye. This is why the situation is so bad. There is complicity here. The goal is to prevent people from coming to Europe. This mess is not an accident. So remember that all refugees have already risked their lives to come to Europe. And if this is true, then they're trying to make the conditions so bad that it's worse than what the refugees have risked their lives for. Of course, the Greek government is not publicizing this strategy, and the blame is actually kind of difficult to assign. The Greek government, for its part, says, hey, we're struggling with our own problems. We have an economic depression and huge unemployment rates. So EU, help us out here. Don't make us bear the burden of the refugee crisis. And even some Greek officials are very pro-refugee. The mayor of Lesbos, while we were there, led an island-wide strike to bring attention to the fact that the island was struggling and that the treatment of residents, of refugees of Moria was unacceptable. So it's really complicated who is to blame for Moria. But what's clear is that the deterrence is not effective. There's still hundreds of refugees arriving every week. And so Moria just keeps getting more and more overcrowded.
So Zoe and I were working in the second refugee camp on Lesbos. And this camp is called Kurata Bay, and it's an incredibly unique refugee camp. It's actually a blueprint, and it's one of the best refugee camps in all of Europe and probably all of the world as well. And so Kurata Bay was started by the mayor of Lesbos, who found Moria to be an unacceptable solution to all of the refugees who are arriving. And Kurata Bay houses about 1,200 refugees who have been designated as vulnerable. So this means families, elderly, disabled, and sick, primarily. And so half of all the refugees living in Kurata Bay are children. And just keep in mind, so Kurata Bay has 1,200, Moria has about 5 times this number. And so most refugees living in Kurata Bay are coming from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, as well as Eritrea, Congo, and some other countries too. And all have come all the way from their home country, by foot, by bus, by train, every story is different, through Turkey to Lesbos. And they come from Moria over to Kurata Bay. And Kurata Bay only allows as many people to live there as it has capacity for. And so, as Zoe mentioned, there are thousands of children in Moria that should be living in a place like Kurata Bay, but the waiting list for Kurata Bay is so long that people may never get to Kurata Bay or have to wait many months or years. And so in Kurata Bay, there are a lot of nonprofits that are active in the camp. The municipality that runs Kurata Bay is a lot more open to collaboration with foreign nonprofits than the military in Moria is. And so conditions are adequate. Meals are given out 3 times a day, and every family, up to 10 people, lives in what's called an isobox, which is on this slide on the left. And it's essentially an empty trailer. There are bunk beds as the only furnishing, and each family gets to live in one of these. And so when you compare it with Moria, the video you just saw that while Zoe was speaking, it can seem kind of luxurious, right? But take a minute and imagine your family living here. You're sharing one room, there are communal bathrooms, cold showers even in the winter, and really no privacy. So one thing that makes Kurata Bay really unique is that there's a shared philosophy among all the organizations and volunteers in camp management to restore dignity to refugees living there. And so this starts with the terminology. And so instead of calling Kurata Bay a refugee camp, we refer to it as a village. And also, instead of calling refugees a refugee, we use the term resident. And we don't want to use the term refugee because we don't want to define these people by their political status. And so right now, they are residents living in Kurata Bay village. So for the rest of this presentation, we will use those terms because that's what we used during our time in Lesbos. So one example is that, as Zoe mentioned, in Moria, people wait in line for many hours for their food. And in Kurata Bay, a couple different organizations bring food to every house for every meal. And so, of course, I don't know everyone's personal situations, but probably the majority of us have not had to wait in line for our food. It's not a very humanizing thing. And so this is one small effort that's done in order to make Kurata Bay more of a village. Also, a lot of different organizations try to capitalize on residents' talents and professions. And so, for example, we met a barber from Iraq, and an organization gave him supplies, the tools, to open his own little barber shop, which was just him sitting at a table, and every day from morning until night he was cutting residents' hair. And so this not only fulfilled the needs of the camp, but also helped to restore this residents' self-efficacy. And in addition, there were a lot of different activities held by organizations that tried to create a sense of normalcy and community within Kurata Bay. And so on the left, this is a mix of residents and volunteers that were working together in a community kitchen to prepare a meal for all the residents of Kurata Bay for a holiday. And on the right is a picture of the weekly Kurata Bay party. And Zoe will tell you a little bit more about this, but it was an event every week that people young and old, all volunteers and all residents were invited to. And so providing a space to have fun is also an essential part of restoring dignity. On a more personal note, Zoe and I feel really lucky to have worked in Kurata Bay. Every day we met inspiring and resilient and fun people. And so now when we think of refugees, these images and these people come to mind. And so in Kurata Bay, as I mentioned, there were a lot of different organizations that worked there. About half of them were large international organizations. You might recognize a name or two up here. And the other half were small nonprofits that were made just to work in Kurata Bay. And they came from around the world, from Holland and Greece and Portugal and Israel, England, and everywhere. And together they provided services such as education for kids, community meals that were provided, as I mentioned, medical care, as well as psychosocial support. And there were also men's and women's spaces to provide them language classes and other activities.
And the other organization active in the camp was called Movement on the Ground. And this is the organization that Talia and I got to work with for those 3 months. So Movement on the Ground is only active in Kurata Bay. It's really small. It was founded back in 2015. And the small size of the organization allows it to be really flexible. So we're often one of the first organizations to respond to a new need in the camp, just because we don't have that bureaucracy to work through. So we sort of fill in the gaps of Kurata Bay, but one of our foundational projects was the solar panels. So for a long time, Kurata Bay did not, or when it was started, Kurata Bay did not have any electricity. And so Movement on the Ground set up 12 solar stations. You can see in the picture on the right, this is a group of combined international volunteers and resident helpers building a solar station. And then we're also responsible for all the electrical wiring throughout the camp. So that's me setting up a new ISO box, getting ready for a family to move in. We also handle material donations. So we have 2 warehouses, and we organize and then distribute donations to go to the residents. This picture here is 6,000 winter coats that came from Amsterdam, which we then got to distribute in Moria and Kurata Bay. There is an extremely popular soccer program or sports program in Kurata Bay. Almost every single child is signed up for it, and they get bus over to a field down the road and get to play like they used to in their home countries. And they learn values as well, like teamwork and respect. While Talia and I were there, Movement on the Ground opened up 2 community kitchens. Talia was actually instrumental in setting up the organization of that. And so, as Talia mentioned, the residents do get food provided to them, but it's not the food that they're used to. It's quite bland, not so nutritious, and definitely not what they're used to cooking. It's just not their own food. And so residents for a long time had been cooking their own food on fires outside of their house, which was creative but not so safe when you have lots of kids running around. And so we opened these community kitchens, and it was a huge success right off the bat. Almost every family visits the kitchen at least once, and they use the food that they're given and recreate it into a new dish that the parents really do want to be serving their children. There's a variety of other activities that Movement on the Ground hosts. This here is a cinema morning for little kids, but we do language learning and all sorts of other activities for adults and children. At this point, Talia and I were planning our presentation, and we were trying to think about our biggest takeaways from this experience and what was still with us now that we're back in the US. And the clear answer was that it was the people that we met and the stories that they had shared with us. And so we both want to share some of that with you guys.
So this is Jawad. He's a man in his upper 30s from Afghanistan. And I met Jawad one of my first days in Kurata Bay. I was walking down the main path and overheard someone speaking in perfect Spanish. And this was kind of shocking to my ears. I had just come back or been living in Spain and was used to hearing Spanish there, but not in Greece. And so I walked over to him, and over the next couple of months, I got to know Jawad really well. So Jawad worked for 4 years with the Spanish military in Afghanistan in their efforts to try and get the Taliban out of northwest Afghanistan. And so before Jawad signed his contract to work with them, they promised that he would be given asylum, that he could be a refugee in Spain following the end of his contract. And he worked with the Spanish military for 4 years. And through that, that's how he learned Spanish, just by conversing with soldiers, and quickly became a translator as well. And when the Spanish military pulled out, they did not keep their promise. He's now been waiting for 4 years since finishing his contract and not been given asylum. And so this picture on the right is a certificate thanking him for his hard work, signed by the Spanish military. And unfortunately, this story is not alone. We heard a lot of stories from people who had worked with the American Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. So exactly the same thing. The American Army comes in. Of course, it's helpful to have help from local people as either volunteers or as paid workers. And they were promised asylum upon finishing their work with them. And then the American Army pulls out, and these people are immediately made enemies of whichever group they were helping to fight against. And so their families, and they are threatened, and they are forced to flee pretty immediately. And all these people, same story. They have not been given any sort of asylum from the United States. So returning to Jawad, he not only speaks Spanish, but 5 other languages, and he really wants to work. But with his current asylum status, he cannot legally work. He was volunteering with 4 different nonprofits in Kurata Bay, and he was also teaching informal Spanish classes. And so this is why I heard him this first day speaking with a young teenager in Spanish. It was one of his students in his classes. And so again, he's still waiting to get his asylum from Spain and hopeful and wants to go there. He now speaks the language. We met people who spoke perfect English for the exact same reason and are just waiting on the United States to fulfill their promise.
In contrast with the beauty in Kurata Bay, there is also pain. Most refugees experience trauma in their home countries. I mean, they're leaving for a really serious reason. They're forced to leave. And so for many refugees, they have a long personal history of trauma even before their journey starts. But then there's the journey, and the average length for people that we were meeting was 2 to 5 years. And the journey itself is really traumatic. Every border crossing is illegal. And so there's always the possibility of being deported. And there was often the reality of police or military brutality. Families were often split up as well during this journey. So while we were in Lesbos, Talia and I kept remarking to each other how amazing it was that we kept meeting all these inspiring people. We're like, how is it possible that the island of Lesbos has such a high density of all this inspiration? And I had a realization about why this might be so when I learned part of Fahad's story. So my initial impression of Fahad was that he was a really cool dude, and he knew it. He was the best dancer, like hands down the best dancer of dabka, which is a traditional Arabic dance. And so every Friday night, he would lead the dabka. So one day, Fahad and I had a tedious task to do, and so we sat down, and I asked him, I said, Fahad, how did you become such a great dancer? And he told me that one day he was a little kid in Syria, and he saw this group of men dancing, and he thought, how cool. Like, when I grow up, I want to be just like them. And so he practiced, and he worked at it until he was a really great dabka dancer. And he told me, Zoe, I've been like that my whole life. And he asked if I knew how he came to be living in Kurata Bay. I actually had been wondering because Fahad was a single man. So he didn't come with family. There was no way he was going to be considered vulnerable and move to Kurata Bay. In fact, single men are usually considered the most threatening, right? That's who we hear about in the media as, oh, the single men, they're going to bring terrorism. Fahad was a prisoner of ISIS for 2 months until he escaped. And so the fact that Europeans or Americans fear that he's going to bring terrorism to their country is just the most perverse kind of irony. But in any case, it was surprising that he had been able to move to Kurata Bay. So I said, no, Fahad, please tell me. I would love to hear your story. And he said he'd been living in Moria for a couple months, and he realized that there was this other camp down the road that actually had livable conditions. And so he would walk to Kurata Bay every day, and he would introduce himself to someone. He'd say, hey, my name's Fahad. Can I help you out today? And he did this every day for 3 months until he went up to the camp director after those 3 months, and he said, hey, my name's Fahad. I've been working here every day for the last 3 months, and the people here know me, and they like me and respect me, and I would like to move here. I'd like to live here. And the camp director said yes. So with that, Fahad had found a way to get himself to where he wanted to be, but his next move was to go back to Moria. And the next day, he walked up, and he said, hey, this is my friend Mohammed. Can he work with us today? And so the 5 guys you see pictured here, Fahad is second to the right, but he brought those 4 guys over with him from Moria one by one, introducing them to the people that he knew and that he worked with. And so now they all live together in an ISO box, and they share clothes, and they share food, and they call each other brother, and they mean it, because they've all lost their family in whatever journey they took to get here. And so now they're acting as family for each other. So Fahad's story of determination and powerful friendship is special, but it's not unique. Like I mentioned, everyone that we met was inspiring like this, had a story like this. And like Fahad, these stories didn't always come out right away because that was just who they were and who they'd always been. But it wasn't random chance that Talia and I were meeting all these incredible people. To have made it as a refugee in Lesbos and then live there for years while maintaining hope for your own future and compassion for other people and enthusiasm for building a community, it takes an inner strength that's just striking.
So I'd now like to introduce you to Hushal. He is in the picture on the left, the person standing up higher. And Hushal is a father of 2 young children from Afghanistan. And we met Hushal one day when we were working on installing electricity on some of the new ISO boxes. And Hushal came over and asked if he could help. And we very quickly learned that he had been an electrician for many years in Afghanistan. And he genuinely told us that he was available anytime, any day. He said, Talia, just come knock on my door. I want to help whenever I can. And so I got to know Hushal very well over the next couple of months. He was most passionate when he was talking about his 2 young kids and his hopes for their future. And since he has no legal work status, like all of the residents living in Kurata Bay, he felt horrible that he couldn't provide for his family like he once could. He told us stories of working 12 or more hour days in Turkey so that he could be able to afford the boat ride over to Lesbos. And on his first and second attempts, he was actually taken, his whole boat was taken by the Turkish police back to Turkey. And so finally on his third attempt, he made it over and was in Moria for a few months before coming to Kurata Bay. And so though his children are now safe, they were not enjoying the childhood that he hoped that they could have. There was no heat for his family, and there was nothing he could do about it, but his dedication and his love as a father was really heartwarming to see, though it was also heartbreaking to know the pain that he had gone through with his family. And so, as we've mentioned, a lot of families are split up during this journey or before even taking it. A lot of residents had not seen their parents or siblings in over 5 years, but sadly this division and ripping apart of families doesn't end when people get to Lesbos. So children, especially boys, if they're over 18, are considered a separate asylum case from the rest of their family. And so they come with the same trauma, the same history, they're coming from the same place, but their cases of these older boys can take years or months longer to process. So unaccompanied minors are children and youth who are under 18 who have come to Lesbos alone. And typically there's additional support and alternative housing for unaccompanied minors outside of the camps, but it's been full for a lot of months. And so as a result, there are now over 300 unaccompanied minors living in Moria. So the video you're going to see behind me is from Section B, which is the area where they live in Moria. So the majority of these teenagers are boys, and every night they are locked in with the girls in Section B with no supervision. Not a single adult is there to provide support, to look out for their safety, or help them through this long and challenging process. And so nearly all of the teenage girls living there are now pregnant due to rape, and the conditions are really awful. So we did want to tell you that actually in Traverse City, the organization Bethany Christian Services is working to place refugee unaccompanied minors in local homes here in Traverse City. So currently there are 3 unaccompanied minor refugees. They're all females from sub-Saharan African countries living in Traverse City, and another one is coming next week. And I was speaking with someone from Bethany, and he was saying that they've been doing really well. In general, the community has been welcoming, and they're doing well in school, and they're waiting for more minors to come. So they had a lot of families lined up, Bethany Christian Services did, and then with the travel ban put in place last year, everything came to a complete halt. And so since December, it started to pick up a little bit, and so they are looking for more families and support. So if you're interested, feel free to write me an email. We'll have our contact information at the end, and I can put you in contact with them. So throughout this presentation, Zoe and I have been criticizing European governments for not doing more. But it's important to note that the United States has been really negligent as well. So under the current administration, the refugee resettlement is being underfunded, and the caps on the number of refugees that we're allowing into our country has dramatically lowered as well.
So as we've mentioned a couple times now, people live in Kurata Bay or Moria for a couple months, a couple years, and it's really unknown who's going to be moved through the process faster than others. People actually get a knock on their door the day before they're given a boat ticket to leave to mainland Greece. So they're told you have 24 hours to pack up your life that you've been building, and they might be sent to Athens, they might be sent to northern Greece, they might actually be sent to another island. We had some friends who were sent to Crete to relocate there. And this unknown of the future and the lack of control over the future is a huge mental burden, especially on the adults living in Kurata Bay. Refugees are not coming to Europe to be living in a refugee camp, to be living in the conditions that they're living in now. But if they're frustrated about those conditions, there's nothing they can do to change it. They can't work harder. They can't. It's a process that is totally working above them. So our friend Fardeen had been struggling with this lack of control. Fardeen is a 17-year-old from Afghanistan. And when I met him, he was falling deep into a depression. He felt like as a teenager, he wasn't learning, he wasn't growing in Kurata Bay, and he didn't see that his life was going anywhere, which was really hard to hear. But there was another volunteer, a Portuguese volunteer named Jawad, and he was a music therapist by training and decided to give Fardeen one-on-one music therapy. I don't want you guys to get the wrong impression. Fardeen is the only refugee on the island of Lesbos that's getting music therapy. But they had a lot of sessions together, and what came out of it was a rap, which I'm going to play for you, just a small section of it, because it exhibits Fardeen talking about this mental burden of not being in control of your destiny. Fardeen's awareness of himself and of the human condition astound me every time I listen to the rap. And I have to remind myself that he's only 17, and also that English is his third language. So I'm going to play that section for you now, but we also have slips of paper that we can hand out at the end with the link to the full rap, if you guys would like to listen.
Have you heard about the cross? Well, I crossed the sea with the 80 other souls. One boat on me. It's the best chance money can buy. Maybe you cross, maybe you die. What a moment of peace. I was so very happy to step in the crease. But wait just a second. What is this treason? The moment I arrived, they sent me to prison.
No man, no prison, refugee camp. This is your home now, here is your tent. I know it's for 2, but you live here with 10. Someday you go, but I don't know when.
2 months in Moria, living like this. Nothing to do but to stare the abyss. Fights every night, fires every night. It was a battlefield, not a campsite. But one day a miracle has happened to me. They've changed me to KT and then I was free. Compared to Moria, which was living hell. Kurata Bay was a 5-star hotel. But 1 year has passed in this operation. In my mind I have only one question. How much longer do I have to wait? Will I ever be the master of my fate?
Never let nobody tell you how to live. It's in you the power to love and forgive. When life knocks you down, you feel in the ditch, but you get up and say you hit like a bitch. Never let nobody tell you how to live. It's in you the power to love and forgive. When life knocks you down, you feel in the ditch, but you get up and say you hit like a bitch. When there's nothing to do, you just lay down and sleep. But soon you find out that the mattress is deep and it's hard to get up. That's Fardeen's confession. That's how you dive into depression. So Fardeen say no and rose up instead. If his life went to waste, then he'd rather be dead. The world hasn't stopped, so why should he? We choose who we are and he chose to be. And that's when I've met this good friend of mine. He went back to school and believe me, he's fine. Learns English and Greek, you should see how it goes. Oh, and he volunteers in 3 great NGOs. So this is his story, at least for so far. And this is his message wherever you are. You can live without a roof, you can live without soap. One thing you can't live without is living with hope.
So I just want to let you know that I've played this rap for other audiences before, and I told Fardeen, I asked his permission, of course, first, and I told him afterwards, and he was so happy. I think he would be really happy to know that you all saw this and that he got an applause. So I'll be sure to pass that on to Fardeen.
So we want to give you all just a couple of different ways that you can get involved with the refugee crisis. The first is to volunteer. So Zoe and I had an amazing experience in Lesbos volunteering. Like we said, we've met so many incredible people. Every day was fulfilling and challenging. And so if you're interested in volunteering, we highly recommend Movement on the Ground. But there are also a lot of other really great nonprofits working there. So please contact us by email or come up to us at the end, and we are more than happy to share our experience. The next is to donate money. So Movement on the Ground is a nonprofit, and they have only 1 paid staff. Everyone else, even a lot of full-time people, are volunteers. And so we saw where the money is going directly to refugees, and so we encourage you to donate if that's something you're interested in. We have information at the back on how to do this. You can write a check. You would actually make that out to me, and we will be donating all the money or cash. You can send that to our house, or you can go online. And there are instructions in the back about how to do that. Or if you have any questions as well, you can feel free to email us. We want to encourage you not to send material items. And this is because the shipping costs, as you can imagine, from here all the way to a small island in Greece are really expensive, and also movement on the ground and other organizations are trying to help the local Greek economy. And so as much as they can, they try to buy local products, and so money or volunteering your time are much more useful. There's also the opportunity to get involved locally, as I mentioned, in Traverse City with Bethany Christian Services. And lastly, I encourage you to stay informed. So thank you all for coming to this, and I think it's really important just to read multiple sources because there are so many misconceptions from the media, from a lot of different places about what is a refugee, why are they fleeing, why do they want to come. And so just kind of sharing what you've learned tonight or what you've learned by speaking with other people or reading is a really valuable thing to do. So we wanted to end tonight with a quote from Mohammed, who is the first person that Zoe introduced you to. How can we keep creating war but keep pretending we aren't creating refugees? The refugees come with hope that they will finally be listened to, only to find themselves told they don't deserve to be here. We are not the enemy, but if you listen to us, we can be part of the answer. So thank you so much for coming. We now will take any questions that you have. We know it's been long, so feel free to leave. And this is our contact information. As we said, we also have contact information and the different ways to donate, as well as a link to Fardine's rap on slips of paper at the back, which our parents will be handing out.